I'm going to talk about biodiversity, the variety of living things from ants to eagles, from the tiny moss growing in the pavement cracks to the tallest of trees. Now, you may be expecting a lot of statistics and even some graphs, but I appreciate they're not everyone's idea of fun, so I'm going to try and keep them to a minimum. If you want to get your fill of numbers, then they're all on the NatureScot website. All of the evidence is independently checked, so you can be sure of its quality. So let's talk about what pressures are affecting biodiversity. Globally, there are 5 main ones, and all of them are having an impact in Scotland. These are changing use of sea and land, direct exploitation, pollution, invasive non-native species, and of course, climate change. And behind these pressures are 2 very important underlying causes. Many people become disconnected from nature, and as a result, they don't recognise the value of nature. If people don't feel connected to nature, then they don't care for it and its importance, and so they're more likely to overexploit and to not take seriously the impacts of climate change and pollution and of invasive non-native species. On the other hand, many of us care passionately, and the evidence shows that we can make a difference. For example, we've analysed data for 580 species of birds, mammals, butterflies and moths in Scotland. These are the groups for which we have the best data. Since 1994, the abundance of these species has declined by just over 30%. Now, 1994 was chosen as the baseline because it was the earliest for which we had good data. We know that there had been a decline in numbers for many species prior to that. So this means that the actual drop over the last century is likely far higher. We know that some of these groups, such as butterflies, have done quite well in the short term. Butterflies benefit from a small increase in summer temperatures, and both generalists and specialists are doing well overall. Some of the rarer species have also benefited from projects targeted at their conservation. This shows that work by land managers and volunteers can turn back the tide for some species. However, for the next 10 years or so, we expect butterflies to suffer as drought and fires increase, killing adults and destroying the food plants their caterpillars need. We're already seeing a decline in moths. Now, many of us overlook moths. They're less glamorous than their showy cousins, the butterflies, but they are important pollinators, and they also act as food for many of our familiar birds and other animals. We looked at nearly 300 types of moth, and it's not possible to say what's driving the decline for every single one of them, but the most common cause appears to be the loss or damage to their habitats. We often think of Scotland as being a pristine land of nature, but nothing could be further from the truth. Sometimes managed habitats can benefit nature and provide livelihoods, such as farms which host internationally important species. Scotland is becoming more built up though, with more land covered by impermeable surfaces like concrete and tarmac every year. In some cases around 40% of the land. And soil that's been covered can no longer trap carbon. It's inaccessible to most wildlife, and it also increases the risk to all of us from flooding. While protected areas for nature is part of the solution in the biodiversity crisis, it's not always effective. Only 64% of our protected woodlands are in favourable or recovering condition, and only 30,000 hectares of Scotland's unique Atlantic rainforest remains, and even this is highly fragmented, making it difficult for wildlife to move between the patches that are left. We tend to think of Scotland's hills and plains, its cities or its farmlands, but most of Scotland is sea. And that sea is internationally important for its nature, as well as being a major source of food and wealth. Scotland's marine assessment in 2020 highlighted declines in many key habitats and species, such as Atlantic salmon. It found that fishing remains a widespread impact on the seabed, and that climate change is now the most important factor affecting the marine environment. Even before the current bird flu outbreak, our seabirds had declined heavily, including species for which Scotland holds globally significant populations, like Manx shearwater and great skua. The key drivers for these losses have been fisheries, climate change and invasive non-native species. These twin crises are real. They're affecting us in Scotland and we can already see the impacts. I don't want to leave you on a negative note. We've tackled biodiversity crises in the past and we've had some successes. When I was young, most of our lowland rivers were highly polluted. The air in our towns and cities was toxic to lichens and mosses and certainly wasn't doing people any good either. But since the 1990s, pollution controls, particularly improvements to fresh water and air, have benefited many species and people. Mosses and liverworts are good indicators, and we've seen an upturn in sensitive species. Similarly, freshwater invertebrates like mayflies have seen very large increases in their distribution. However, long-term effects of atmospheric pollutants on sensitive habitats remain evident, and in addition, new air and water pollutants are a concern. But what it tells me is that coordinated policy can deliver results. What we need now is for you to tell us what you think. So please take part in this consultation.